Thursday, but plan on there being between 10 to 15 multiple choice questions, about 6 IDs, 6 to 8 IDs, meaning we give you a term like economic development and then have you define it in 3 to 4 sentences. And then probably 2 essays. And you'll have 2 hours to complete it. So should have more than enough time. It's not it won't be a particularly long test, but it'll probably take you the full 2 hours. Also, Evan, you have a TA session after class today where you will be talking about the growth models some more.
Right.
Especially the ones we're talking about today. Good. And yes, are there any questions, concerns, any logistical matters you're particularly worried about? No? Really? Okay, good. I'm a little surprised, but I guess you guys are just a bit quiet. That's fine. So, last week we actually didn't finish the lecture 4. So what I want to do today is go over solo again. I want to just present technological progress from another viewpoint, because I sense there's a bit of confusion regarding it, and some of that is undoubtedly due to my own delivery of the material. So we're going to try that one more time. Then we'll go over to the 2-sector models. We'll review Lewis's labor surplus model. Then we'll talk about the Neoclassical 2-sector model. And then finally we'll conclude the 4th lecture with the discussion of structuralism. Structuralism is related to dependency theory, which is very popular in Latin America, and is kind of another explanation for the underdevelopment of the global south, the third world. Then we'll jump right into today's lecture, which is, of course, the debate between states and markets. And we present this lecture as if states and markets are 2 separate sides of a broad spectrum. The pendulum always swings between both of them, insofar as to what extent do we trust states, state intervention, the acts of government to ensure positive economic outcomes, versus markets, which have their own benefits, which are very good at coordinating mass activity, but their own costs. So we're going to talk about the benefits and costs of states and markets as tools of development. And we're going to do so through several ways. We'll talk about markets and market failures. We'll talk about market pessimists and market optimists. We will mention market reforms that the IFIs, namely the World Bank and IMF, put forth, namely stabilization policy and structural adjustment. We'll talk about what it means to reform, credibility and timing of reform, sequencing in particular. And then we'll end with a discussion of the so-called Washington Consensus. That is a term coined by our next-door neighbor, John Williamson, at the Institute of International Economics. And we will debate the merits of that in light of the rise of the so-called Beijing Consensus, which is, of course, that of the Chinese development model. Right? So jumping right into this, last week we ended with the solo growth model, absent technological progress, looking something like this. We have our per capita income line. We have our savings per capita line, or investment per capita, right? S times Y. And we have some depreciation line, plus population growth rate, times K. And we look to the intersection of that to find our steady state level of capital stock per capita. Now this is what's happening graphically, as I'm sure you're well aware, having done your problem set or in the process of doing. You recall that you can find a numerical answer for this by recalling the law of motion of capital, which states that any change in the capital stock per capita in a given period is equal to some investment over a given period minus depreciation plus population growth rate quantity times capital stock. And of course, in the steady state, we know that delta K equals 0. Okay, this we know already. Now the question is, how do we incorporate technological progress into our broader model? Well, I want to draw your attention to the first production function we gave you. This, again, is not in per capita terms, it's in aggregate terms. Y equals A times K to the alpha, L to the 1 minus alpha. Okay? Quick review, what's alpha?
TFP.
It's the
Total
share in the
Alpha.
the
Not A.
Alpha, I'm sorry.
Yeah, alpha is,
the share it accounts or the amount it accounts for the output.
yeah, so you can, that's one way of thinking about it, or capital share of total income, right? And labor share of total income is 1 minus alpha, naturally. They can only split 100% of the pie. Okay, this term here we call total factor productivity. Okay? Total factor productivity, you could think of as just an efficiency term for your units of production. Okay? The greater your total factor productivity, the greater your total output will be given any amount of capital and given any amount of labor. Okay? It makes sense. If you are more productive, if your capital is more productive, you will do more with less or more with the same amount. Now, the way we incorporate technological progress into this model is that we concede that total factor productivity is relevant even in the per capita production function. Little y equals big A times k to the alpha. We further posit that the change in total factor productivity grows at some rate g. Some rate of technological growth. So technological progress can be considered a positive shock to our production function. Okay? Technological progress can be conceived of as a positive shock to the production function. So, how do I show this graphically then? Well, think about it this way. As technological progress continues, income for any given level of capital stock per capita will be higher. I repeat, for any rise in technological progress, for any rise in total factor productivity, income for any given capital stock per capita will be higher. So how might I show that on my graph?
Shift upwards.
Shift the income line up, like so. And if our income line shifts up, this is of course the increase in the purple line, what's going to happen to my investment line? Will also go up because we have the same income function in our investment line as we do in our per capita income function. So our savings line will increase with it. Does this make sense to everybody? This is another way of thinking of technological progress. Yeah, when?
I don't know if this is getting overly technical, but I think at some point in the last lecture you talked about the difference between a shift and a pivot. This is more of a pivot, because I mean it still intersects the origin, right?
This I guess would be considered a shift. And when I say pivot, what I really mean is that the slope of the line changes, of the depreciation line. That's what I'm really referring to when we say pivot. Okay?
I think you're making a distinction between moving along the line and shifting up the line.
Well, in this case, we're actually shifting the line,
Right.
which will then move us along the line to the higher steady state, right? Because think about it this way, this old steady state is no longer a steady state. How do we know? Because this term is greater than that term. Therefore, delta k is greater than 0. At the old steady state, with the improvement in technology, this term is greater than this term. Hence, we will grow our capital stock and actually get to a higher steady state level of income. Yep.
I'm sorry, your word on the board, technical progress is a positive shock to what?
The production function. Yep. Okay. So that's just another way of thinking about technological progress. We're not going to drill you on solving this mathematically, but we want you to be aware of it conceptually. Okay? We've given you a couple ways of thinking about it. Okay. Any other questions on that? Yep, Matt?
Maybe that's the question, but just
The statement and observation?
Well, even though you said don't think about it mathematically, I mean, for those of us done graphing, I mean, it's simply the same graph, and you just have a different number you're multiplying. You still have the same graph, you're just intersecting the y-axis. So.
Yeah. Yep, very good. It's more like a confirmation. Yeah. Very good. So that is Solo. I know we have drilled this into your mind for 3 lectures now. I assure you it's as important as the attention we're giving it. Okay? All right. So let's move right along. So in covering,
Quick question. Why
Yeah,
do I
sure.
get it confused with theta?
I'm sorry?
Theta, wasn't that also technological?
Yeah, so technological theta and g, they're the same terms.
But that was like n plus depreciation plus theta. So your
So that was, you can think of the model we learned on Thursday, that was income per effective worker. Okay? That's one way of thinking about technological change is purely labor augmented.
okay.
Right? That's what we did on Thursday. Today, just another way of thinking about it. Okay? Alright, so the two-sector model. Recall that in the two-sector model, we have 2 industries. We have agriculture and manufacturing. Agriculture and industry. Okay? Furthermore, we have our agricultural production function that looks something like this. Okay. We have our quantity of agricultural goods produced, and we have the total amount of labor employed in agriculture. 2 things. 1, past a certain point, let's say point D, equal increments of additional labor yield no extra output. Right? This exhibits diminishing returns. And it exhibits diminishing returns so much that subsequent increases in labor do nothing to our total output. Okay, there's no marginal increase in total food production because we hire people past this point in point D. Okay? That's the first thing. Now, I wasn't clear about the difference between the industry supply curve of labor and the agricultural supply curve of labor, so I want to clarify that now. Okay. This point A, okay? This is again labor. Call point B because we're talking about labor. So, talking about agriculture. At point B, you can consider this to be the point where the entire labor force is employed by agriculture. Okay? At point B, the entire labor force is employed by agriculture. Now, hence, the marginal product of labor employed in agriculture is 0. Right? That's the equivalent of a point all the way out here. You guys see that? If we were to have some labor, let's say this value of B was equal to 1,000 laborers, right? That would be equivalent right here, 1,000 laborers, right? Marginal product equal to 0. The slope is flat. Do you guys see that? is we hire more labor, the marginal product of labor in agriculture falls until it approaches 0. Okay? And it levels off, right? And these largely mimic each other. Yeah,
So it's really going backwards
Mhm.
in this case.
Yeah. In the agriculture side. The industry
Right.
side's separate, okay?
Right.
I think that's where there was some confusion last week. So, in order to get people to move out of agriculture and into industry, okay, you need to get them to leave their low productivity jobs and move into industry where presumably they will be more productive. Now, what's the key here? The key to this model relates to the fact that every worker is paid some subsistence wage. Okay? Every worker has to survive, so every household gets some subsistence wage per household member. The reason why this is relevant is that this subsistence wage puts a floor on how low the price of labor can go. You can't pay labor less than the subsistence wage, or else everybody will die. It's an assumption of the model. Everybody clear up until this point? So now, let's introduce industry. So let's say we had some demand for goods in industry. Okay? Now the industry supply curve is normal. As we move to the right, that's an increase in labor in industry. Another way to think about it is as we move to the right on this graph, it's a fall in labor employed in agriculture. Two sides of the same coin, because they both hire from the same labor pool. So again, we have some subsistence wage, and we have some supply curve of labor in industry. So the question is, why do we have this very long horizontal section in the supply curve of labor in industry? Anyway. Yeah, mine?
For the book, it's elastic.
Okay.
The,
Perfectly elastic.
Perfectly elastic, so
Yep.
wages do not need to rise to attract, well, there's a couple of things. One, you're asking why it's flat, it's elastic, but why it's not at 0, it's basically, it's a persistence point you just before.
Because this is how much they make in agriculture anyway. Okay? So you have to pay them, for the sake of simplicity, the same amount that they're making in agriculture. That's why that establishes a minimum wage you can think of, a binding subsistence minimum wage. Furthermore, because there's this huge supply of excess labor in agriculture, it's possible that we can hire away employees from agriculture without decreasing total agriculture production. I.e., we can reduce employment from, let's say, 1,000 to 500 and leave agriculture,
The same point.
what's that?
At the same.
At the same level.
But not beyond, I mean below the D level.
Then things get dicey. Yeah. So,
The question is, how do you know where you stop hiring from agriculture?
that is the question. And we have measures for that. So the key is here, why is this relevant? Well, if we know that total output, okay, Y, is a function of how much stuff is produced in agriculture and how much stuff is produced in industry, our initial demand for industry goods increases the amount of production in industry without changing production in agriculture. You see, reallocating inefficiently used workers from agriculture and moving them to industry is a source of economic growth. Because there are so many workers in agriculture such that their marginal product is nothing. So So there's no opportunity cost from taking them out of agriculture and putting them in industry. That's the upshot of this model. Now, how long does that work? Well, up until a point, right? Because eventually demand could go all the way out here. What happens? Well, wages start to rise, and wages start to rise, right? Because the amount of labor, we might get to a point right here, right? Where we start taking out enough labor from agriculture that agricultural wages start to rise. Well, why is that a problem? If wages start to rise, what happens to profits, the firms?
They're lowering their profits.
Profits could go down. So there's a certain tension between industry and agriculture in this model. Okay? The key here, there are a couple of key assumptions that kind of flow through this model. The first, the subsistence wage is critical here. The second is that we have such an excess supply of workers in agriculture that there's no impact on total output in agriculture if we were to take some away. Okay? And this also tends to downplay transaction costs of getting workers out of agriculture and into industry. But this model's important, namely because it shows how the masses of underemployment can be utilized for economic growth at no cost to any industry. Right? An excess supply of labor in agriculture is the source of economic growth, is the fuel of industrialization. That's the upshot of this model. That's why it's so powerful. Okay? Yep, question?
Could you explain again what you just said about that there's a tension between agriculture and industry? Can you
Sure.
articulate that tension?
So, as demand for industry goods goes up, wages in both industries will start to go up. Because eventually, in order to, you have to think about it this way, the marginal product of labor rises as the number of people working in agriculture goes down, right? The slope is steeper, right? So, assuming workers are paid their marginal product, past the point of subsistence, agricultural wages start to rise as industry demand goes up, right? Excess in industry demand,
Okay.
you're taking people out, right?
Yes.
And that creates tension between the industries,
Okay.
right? Yep. And also it also raises wages across the board,
Right.
which could theoretically undermine profitability of industry as well. Okay?
Repeat the marginal product comment of a few seconds ago.
Sure. So let's say we start at 1,000, okay? What's the marginal product, Lincoln?
0.
0. Let's say we're at 750. Still 0.
0.
Right? But past a certain point, the marginal product's going to start to rapidly rise, right? That's this part of the graph right here, where the marginal product starts to rise. Well, past the subsistence point, workers earn their marginal product. And so it's possible that excess demand in industry could raise wages across the board, which could in turn undercut profits. Okay? Cool. So, any other questions on that? No? Alright. Well, let's jump into the Neoclassical two-sector model. Now, in contrast to Lewis's model, it's more common that we'll face a situation where withdrawal of labor from agriculture actually leads to a small decline in agricultural production. Okay? So NPL is never 0, is the assumption of this model. Moreover, we assume that the model in market for labor in agriculture is efficient, meaning that the wage earned by agriculture is equal to the marginal product of labor in agriculture. first assumption. Wage equal to marginal product, and 2, marginal product labor is never equal to 0. Thus, there is no longer a horizontal section of labor supply, like in the prior model. Make sense? Furthermore, assume that total labor supply is again split between industry and agriculture. So because there's no longer a horizontal section of labor supply in industry, every worker we hire from agriculture decreases total agricultural output. I repeat, because there's no horizontal section of the labor supply curve in agriculture, every worker that industry hires out of agriculture leads to some fall in agricultural production. Recall that total output is equal to agricultural production plus industrial production. Well, in the prior model, increases in QI didn't necessarily do what? Decrease QA. In this model, increases in QI cause some decreases in QA. The point of this is that the total value of GDP, of output, rises only to the extent that industrial production rises more than agricultural production falls. You can think of this model as relaxing the assumptions of the labor glut hypothesis that underpin Lewis's model, right? In a world where the marginal product of labor in agriculture never equals 0, then every worker we take out of agriculture will have some effect on aggregate agricultural production. Therefore, industry and agriculture now, because they share a single labor force, there are huge distributional consequences to this.
Is it proportional?
Well, that's the question. Initially it won't be, but you might hit a point where an increase in agricultural production causes an aggregate fall in GDP. Right? Especially if we start taking those high MPL workers out of agriculture. That's the difference between the neoclassical model and the labor surplus model. Okay?
So which one works better in real life?
Which one's more valid empirically? That's a tough one. It's hard to say, only because this works really well for a closed economy. The issue is agriculture production in the developing world is completely, the incentives facing it are much different than any of the models that we look at because of all of the price distortions, some of which are the West's fault, some of which are their own fault. So it's hard to tell which one's more empirically certain. Which one do you think is more theoretically? Yeah.
I would think in theory, you can look at like sub-Saharan Africa or some of these countries that have these huge unemployment rates, that the Lewis model would be more valid because there is such a huge, 50% unemployment rates.
Sure. But one of the assumptions of the Lewis model is that people are paid some subsistence wage, right? Many parts of Africa, people aren't even subsisting, right? And so anyway, you're right, but that's another consideration, right? Yeah.
China would be a better example of the Lewis model, wouldn't it? Because how else, I can't think of any other way to explain its trajectory of growth other than some combination of A and this.
Sure. That's very fair. I mean, much of China's industrialization has been based on moving workers from the center, particularly the west of the country, moving them to the coast into more higher productive jobs, and you haven't really seen a fall in agricultural production in China. This model gets a little distorted too because countries can now import food, so they get specialized and gain from trade. So where the rubber hits the road, it gets a little complicated. But yeah, I think China's a good example of Lewis's model. Yeah. These are all interesting things. Now, if we believe the neoclassical two-sector model, then what might that tell us about, I don't know, trade protectionism? Things like subsidies to agriculture production. Good idea, bad idea, why?
Be bad idea,
Why is that?
because it would discourage, industrialization.
It could discourage industrialization? Yeah, that's a fair point. Now, what if you specialize to the point where, let's say you just follow market signals, okay? And you are really good at producing industrial goods and really bad at producing agricultural goods. And you start specializing more and more in industry, okay? What's going to happen to the labor employed by industry?
Increase.
It's also going to go up, okay? And so agricultural output will do what? It'll go down, right? So this works in a world where you can get your food from somebody else, right? But sometimes that might not be the case. Countries face a lot of food insecurity, right? So the issue is, if you believe in the consequences of the two-sector model, that an increase in industrial production will lead to a fall in agricultural production, and you think that the countries from whom you import your food might not be on your side 10 years from now, then there's a sensible security argument to be made for why you might want to subsidize corn production, let's say. I'm making that up. Anyway, these models are kind of alive and well in these other policy discourses. That's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah, question?
Well, I understand these are just the models and they explain the basic rules, but what about the countries that cannot produce enough agricultural products to feed the population? They have to, where do they shift from? Their agriculture is not developed enough that they have to start with the industry first.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point, and then hope the benevolence of other countries.
Because not every country has resources to have all the population, let's say, or all the labor employed in agriculture. They have minimum agriculture, they have to import.
Sure.
So what do they do then? Where do
When
they
you
start?
You raise your hand.
Separately.
Separately? Okay, yeah, Adisa, you want to take a crack at that?
You go somewhere where they have excess labor and land and you buy that.
Yeah, that might
No,
be.
but what do you do? I mean, with your own population, I mean, that's
You-
what I don't get in this model.
You go to Zimbabwe and buy it.
You hope you have good trading partners.
Yeah.
I mean, you're heavily invested then in the sanctity of the international trading system, right?
Exactly.
Good example, this is a country like Korea. Okay, it's very hard for them to feed themselves on their own.
Yeah.
Much of their food is imported. And why do you? I mean, they're heavily invested. They hosted a G20 meeting. The international economic system, the incentives facing middle powers in the international economic system is always maintaining the status quo because you're so dependent on it. And so anyway, there's foreign policy dimensions to this too. But that's all the fun stuff. So let's get back to economics. Just kidding. So to conclude lecture 4. In the theories of economic growth, I want to end with this brief discussion on the Latin American structuralists. So has anybody ever heard of dependency theory? Maya, a little bit? Yeah? Why don't you fill us in?
Actually, I can't remember enough to describe it because I've read about it.
Okay. Maya?
Please, yeah.
Totally punted to you, Maya.
Kind of blanking, but.
Okay. That's okay. Basically, you can think of dependency theory as an explanation for the underdevelopment of the global south, or the underdevelopment of less developed countries. It is based on something known as world systems theory. And one of the key authors of this is Emmanuel Wallerstein. He's up at Montreal right now. And this argument claims that the world can be divided into 3 areas. We have the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. This particular model argues that core countries, and I'll specify what they are in a second, have exploitative economic relations with both the semi-periphery and the periphery. Now, why is that? Well, they claim that the core countries, who might the core countries be? Well, it'll be places like Western Europe, United States, Japan, increasingly more and more China now. Okay? The core countries exploit the periphery by capitalizing on their natural resources and then selling them back high value-added goods. Think the purchasing of zinc from some less developed country and then selling them some type of computer chip based on that material. Okay? The conversion of low value-added goods into high value-added goods. The conversion of raw materials or primary goods into tertiary and high-level goods. Okay? So there's a strong undercurrent in neoclassical economics, okay, which is the idea that free trade and Ricardian trade theory in particular can lead to a harmony of interest of countries. Right? If every country simply specializes in that which they're good at doing, that in which they have a natural comparative advantage, the world will be better off. All countries will be better off. All countries will have higher welfare. Okay? That's the basis of Ricardian trade theory. That's the basics of neoclassical trade theory that, you know, if you came to SICE and took international trade, the first 2/3 of your course would kind of be some variant of a model with that conclusion. Okay? Now this argument obviously puts that on its head. So what do the Latin American structuralists claim? Well, somebody by the name of Raul Prebisch argued that in peripheral countries, they have the tendency to export their raw materials. Now that we know already, that we can take from the basics of dependency theory. Yet there's a component of the welfare of a country known as their terms of trade. So who knows what the terms of trade are? Anybody?
It's like they get advantageous prices for products for them and lower prices of things they buy.
Sure. So in a good world where we have a favorable terms of trade, we have some price of exports relative to some price of imports. Terms of trade equal the price of exports relative to the price of imports. So over the past 10 years, what do you think's happened to Saudi Arabia's terms of trade? It's improved quite a bit. Why? Because the price of oil has gone from maybe $20 a barrel in 2002, late 2001 to hovering around 100 today, right? With the brief spike at 150 right before September of 2008. So countries' terms of trade can change. And the best situation for a country is to have an improving terms of trade, because that means you can purchase more, your welfare increases, and you can develop economically. Now, ideally, a country's terms of trade should have no relationship to what they export. But what the structuralists argued is that countries on the periphery, namely those in Latin America, specialized in exporting raw materials. And as those countries collectively exported raw materials, world prices of commodities would fall. That's the key. As more and more countries join the international trading system, as more of them engage in international trade, this will lead to an increase in the supply of raw materials offered in the world markets. And as the supply of any good increases, the price of it goes down. Thus, trade expansion leads to falling export prices. Falling export prices is the result of more and more countries coming online and putting their natural resources into global markets. That's the premise of this argument. Now, if we accept that to be the case, that as countries develop and their terms of trade necessarily deteriorate, then do these countries' welfare necessarily improve? No, because the price of their imports is constantly rising relative to the price of their exports. So when the terms of trade go down, this is bad for welfare. Now, why is it that countries specialize in producing cheap natural resources and cheap commodities at the beginning stage of development?
The
Easiest thing to get to. And also ravenous world consumers would love to get their hands on it. And yet, if you were to specialize in what the market, quote unquote, tells you to do, the actual quality of your welfare will go down. And so the key then, for many of these thinkers who believe in structuralism, in particular believe in world systems theory, is that you must develop your own industry in order to compete in world markets. You must develop the capacity to engage and produce goods that are made in the core countries. In other words, you shouldn't allow your natural competitive advantage in producing raw materials put you on a path where you never develop. The way to get out of that is to build up your domestic industries in what the core wants. Now, do many developing countries have those industries already? No. So what type of policy do you think this would recommend?
They'll condition the ability to access those resources on building a factory to do some of the processing.
Sure. Yeah, that's a fair thing. What Ghana did. Yeah, that's definitely a type of it.
Protective tariffs. And
Protective tariffs.
Infant industry.
Infant industry. Oh, that's absolutely true. We have a term for most of these. Yeah. Anything else, Matt?
Or like foreign direct investment to bring in and know-how from those that actually can do this.
Maybe conditionalized on. Yeah, sure. Yeah, Jürgen?
So today there's a little bit of a contradiction to that because China is such a big power. Which
We'll get to that. One second. So the logical conclusion, if you believe in this, is something known as import substitution industrialization. Instead of specializing in raw materials and being forever relegated to the bottom of the global economic hierarchy, better to protect domestic industries using protective tariffs and large subsidies in order to develop domestic industries to the point where they can compete on the world stage. That's what import substitution industrialization prescribes. That's what many, many countries did after World War II, and what many of them did, often to their own detriment. Okay, Jürgen, question.
Could you say that again?
Sure.
The phone.
Come on, the whole rhetorical flourish gets lost if I have to repeat it, but okay. Import substitution industrialization.
Maybe a little slower.
Sure. So the basic premise of import substitution industrialization is this process, right? If you specialize in low value added goods and commodities, your terms of trade are constantly going to get worse and your welfare won't improve. What import substitution says, better to protect your country initially through tariffs and also build up domestic industry via subsidies. This is known, of course, as infant industry protection, right? And once these infant industries mature, so the theory goes, they can then compete on the world stage. And thus, we can drop all the protective mechanisms we put into place. So this lays the intellectual groundwork for import substitution industrialization, which many countries pursued, particularly after World War II. India had a very large import substitution program. Argentina had a very large one, okay? Now, import substitution import substitution industrialization has a very checkered past. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why this might not work. But one of those relates to the concept of rent seeking. Anybody know what rent seeking is? Anybody seek rents?
That's when private officials seek special favors or terms from public officials.
Exactly. So take the automobile industry in India, for instance. Originally, they were given very large subsidies and large protective trade barriers in order to protect them from global trade, and eventually the thought was they would continue to build themselves up, and and then one fine day the government could remove the training wheel, so to speak, get rid of the subsidies and allow them to compete on world markets. Well, what ends up happening, we find, is that when we give these initial subsidies, large bureaucracies develop in order to maintain the subsidy. So think legions of lobbyists in India giving political kickbacks and payoffs to continue the bureaucratic inertia to prevent the infant industry from ever growing up, so to speak. Yeah, question?
I was going to ask the question on this, but you just answered it. I just wanted to complement and probably clarify. So it's very important that the protective tariffs happen and remain only at the initial stage.
If ever. And that's why when we get to kind of the thoughts of the Washington Consensus.
Right. The reason I asked,
Yep.
because all this time, at least people where I come from, thought that what the government did with our automobile industry was incorrect because it really killed the competition.
Mhm.
What happened in the 90s is that they wanted to have the protection. They wanted to protect the local production of the automobiles, and they put the tariffs. So if you want to bring a BMW or any other car from the overseas, you have to pay a 200% tariff
Yeah.
at the border. And in the meantime, they have had this, and they continue having this industry of the automobiles, and they try to put it on the market, but no one really buys it because it's not the same quality.
Mhm.
So what we end up with is on the market right now in my country is that neither do we have the
Sure.
barriers go away, and still we have not an imperfect. So if this is a matter of the public policy, or there's a relationship to, of course, corruption in the government, that's I understand that part.
That's
I guess my
great.
question is, this probably is helpful, and it was maybe 10 years ago, but eventually it has to go away.
Sure.
Do I understand you
And
correctly?
that's the challenge. I mean,
Okay.
this makes sense in theory. The issue is, do you have the mechanisms and the kind of bureaucratic wherewithal to withdraw the subsidy once it's been given? And that is highly dependent on how effective your state is, how insulated your institutions are from private interests, and it really just depends. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, in the EU, several countries at least ditch their agricultural products each harvest or whatever to, I guess, does it feed into the protectionism or just to protect the pricing or?
They burn the excess supply of
Or-
agricultural
Or
products.
they dump their tomato, like France and Spain, they have like tomato wars or whatever, but
Yeah.
they just kind of get rid of their product. I don't know if that's because of protectionism or if they're trying to do some sort of import substitution.
It's probably, protectionism is a mechanism of conducting import substitution. With agriculture though, that's a very complicated issue. There's many reasons why countries do it. And import substitution could be one of them. Some of them might be national pride, etc. Yeah, question?
I just wanted to clarify,
Yeah.
so just the terminology, import substitute. So the idea is you're substituting your domestic industries rather than having.
For imports.
For imports,
Mhm.
okay.
And so by doing so, you can develop your own industry. So in a perfect world, right? If you're Ghana and you see Toyota before back in the day when General Motors, was particularly profitable. They say, okay, we want to have our own domestic automobile industry. So what's the best thing to do? Well, put huge tariffs on foreign manufactured cars, and it also gives subsidies to any entrepreneur, any company that's willing to invest in plants, property, equipment, etc., and workers to make cars. Okay? With the hope being that eventually we'll create our own domestic car industry that is on the level of these global behemoths. The issue is there's so many snags along the way, and the main mechanism of that being that when you have an industry domestically that competes abroad, exporting is a highly disciplining force economically. It ensures that you adopt industry best practices, you cater to actual international demands and preferences of consumers, and ultimately creates more profitable companies, which is one of the reasons why economists advocate trade, openness to markets, generally always, okay? So you can kind of contrast import substitution with export-led growth. And the whole idea that trade openness can actually be a mechanism of growth and not necessarily one that sends you down the path of dependence. Okay? These are kind of broad, these are debates that are very active today. There's right answers and there's less right answers, I would argue. We can talk about that more towards the end of class. Okay? Cool. Well, good discussion on structuralism. If you are at all interested in this, please see me. I have several articles I can point you towards. This is a bit more of a comparative politics topic, so it's a bit outside the scope of the course. Yet it is interesting. So if you have any questions, let me know. Okay? So before we take a break, I want to jump into class 5, discussing states and markets. I want to talk about markets and market failures, and then we will go from there. Let's just talk about markets first, and then we can talk about market failures. Okay, so obviously, as you are all well aware, there's a long-standing debate about the role of markets and states in development. Now, widespread economic reforms were introduced all over the world towards the end of the 1980s and especially the beginning of the 1990s. As you can remember, we had shock therapy in former Soviet republics, we had the rise of the Washington Consensus, the rise of the IMF, the World Bank, giving out loans based on conditionality. This is probably the closest we ever got to a true policy experiment in the social sciences at this level of aggregation. Right? It's very difficult to run experiments in the world just like we might do in a laboratory, but this is about the closest we could reasonably get. Many of the market-oriented policies we will talk about today were actually tested in places like the Russian Federation. And they succeeded and failed for many different reasons. And we're going to talk about those. But one kind of opening point I want you to be aware of is something known as the power of economic ideas. Economic ideas really, in particular economic orthodoxy, is hugely important to development because we are still struggling to find the magic elixir for why countries develop. And this particular lecture really gets to the meat of many of the debates that are taking place all around us in Washington right now and in circles abroad in developing countries. Okay? So, markets themselves, there are many powerful arguments that support the view that most economic activity, most consumption decisions, most production decisions should be governed and coordinated by markets. Now, why is this the case? Well, markets are fairly good, first, at allocation. Now, why is this? Well, markets have the price mechanism. You can think of the price mechanism as the so-called traffic lights of economic activity. Okay? If you want an explanation for why so many of our country's quote-unquote best and brightest graduate from top universities and then work on Wall Street, one need only look at the exorbitant compensation earned by first-year associates and first-year analysts on Wall Street. Okay? If you want to know why so many people are majoring in computer science today, one need only look at the value of technology companies. Prices allow us to make complicated decisions collectively. Furthermore, markets have a good degree of flexibility. Markets are fast. If an industry falls out of favor, the market will be quick to punish losers. Think of the speed by which bank shares fell during the fall of 2008. Moreover, markets are quick to promote winners. They, in turn, help provide strong incentives for economic activity. Economic activity that is valued by society, with the help of markets, will actually bring about more of that economic activity. Moreover, it enhances quality. Markets help enhance competition, which in turn motivates producers to produce as efficiently as possible at the lowest cost possible. That's an important reason why we might trust markets to produce things like textbooks and university education more than governments.
I'm sorry, when you say enhances quality of products or of?
Yeah, namely of products, of economic output, and in turn welfare, right? And finally, markets are good at dispersing power. Now, this is a political economy point, but it's important to remember how much many of the thinkers in the Enlightenment, how much the founders of our own country feared concentrated power. Markets are an excellent check against concentrated power. Large, lumbering industrial conglomerates that don't cater to the needs and interests of consumers ultimately get replaced through a process of creative destruction. Creative destruction, of course, is the propensity of markets, if left to their own design, to get rid of inefficient producers and to reallocate dead capital to newer and more profitable industries. Okay? Anybody know who coined this phrase?
Pardon?
Who coined the phrase, creative destruction?
Adam Smith or something like that.
one of those guys. Joseph Schumpeter. Anybody read The Economist?
Yeah.
Anybody read the Schumpeter column? What does it talk about?
About
About business, right? That's why. Okay?
about that, exactly.
About that exact thing. Okay, now you know how to read The Economist. Alright, so the markets have this natural quality of creative destruction to get rid of losers and pick winners. There's almost a cathartic process then to market downturns. But moreover, markets help preserve individual liberties. Obviously, this is the argument of another Austrian known as Hayek, who argued that economic disarray and central planning necessarily lead to increased supervision, increased centralization of state power, which invariably would decrease the liberties of the people living in that state. And why do you think he thought this? When did he live?
Soviet Union.
What's that? A little before that even. So he really came of age during the rise of the Third Reich and kind of the disarray of the Great Depression, and saw fascism as a natural response to economic disarray. Okay? So those are why markets are very good. Okay? There are many reasons why markets might not be so good, or why markets might sometimes fail. We're going to talk about those after the break. I'm going to take 5 minutes. At 7:05 we can come back, give you a glass of water. We'll go from there, okay? Cool. Do you want to pause this or something? Or?
Yeah. Side button.
So I'll let you deal with it. I don't want to mess it up.
Okay.
Yes. Second one.
I tried to put last class on there to there are restrictions that I can't figure out how to get around, so I talked to IT today.
Okay.
Sit down with me.
Just see me at the water fountain, please.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. Yeah, ideally tomorrow we'll have all the classes up to today on. So, maybe not Blackboard, but just directly through YouTube, and I'll send a message out with all the links. Yeah.
Question that.
Yeah.
This is what I emailed you about.
Yep. Okay.
Okay.
And they were all on there today. I was there for the first time.
As long as you cover everything that's an A and B.
Here?
Yeah, you see this
So-
building?
There's the vending machine downstairs.
Yeah.
That doesn't have any Starbucks.
I don't know.
I'm sorry, what are you?
There's no Starbucks in this building.
No.
Okay. Just leave it as it. We'll
Not within 5 minutes, but if you're looking for something afterwards, there's typically a block quote.
Is that the one that's on,
Exponents
Nineteenth
that.
and N, or
Uh,
Connecticut and N?
yeah, and actually if you go out the back part of the bottom floor,
Okay.
the alley takes you like pretty much straight there.
Okay.
One of the issues I see is that